Moolala is brought to you by the nonprofit credit counseling agency Credit Canada. The disability tax credit can go a long way to reducing the burden for a family dealing with the costs of a family member with a disability. But it is not easy to get the DTC approval. The logistics can be complicated, and some people turn to consultants for help, services that command fees. There is something called the Disability Tax Credit Promoters Restriction Act, and we're going to talk about that, but also this broader question of how you resource people who can help you get the disability tax credit and take advantage of those benefits that the government offers. Jamie Golombek is the Managing Director of Tax and Estate Planning with CIBC Private Wealth Management. He's in Toronto. Hello there.
Hi.
How do you define the disability tax credit? And I guess more specifically, for whom does it make sense?
Well, the disability tax credit is quite a valuable credit. It's available both federally and provincially or territorially, depending on when you live. And it's available to help people with the costs of extra expenses they might incur as a result of the disability. So it is a valuable credit. It's available every year that you have that disability. And there's a whole variety of disabilities that could be applicable. Things from someone who is, for example, blind, someone who's deaf, things like that, including a much more complicated diagnosis of mental functioning, things like that. So there's a broad spectrum of Canadians that may qualify. But if you do qualify and you are certified by a medical practitioner, which we can talk about, then yes, this is a valuable credit. And for some people, it could last their entire lifetime.
Wow. Can you give us a basic sense for how much this is worth? So for parents with kids with exceptionalities, the interventions that they may require, many of which are not covered, could be in the thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. What could the disability tax credit mean in dollar terms at its best?
Sure. So, again, it does vary slightly by province. So if we take BC as an example, federally, it's worth the same everywhere. So for 2023, the credit's worth $1,400. And then for example, in BC, you'd add another about $450 to that. So I'd say on average, depending on the province, it ranges anywhere from let's call it, $1,700, $1,800. And it can actually go as high as $3,000 in Alberta. So it really depends on where you live. This is an annual amount. It can also be transferred to a supporting person if that individual doesn't have enough taxes payable to get the full credit. One other thing I think it's important to point out is that eligibility for the disability tax credit is also a gateway to open up an RDSP, a registered disability savings plan. And that's much more valuable because that disability savings plan allows you to save for an individual with a disability over a long period of time, grow that money completely tax-free, but also take advantage of government grants and government bonds. That could be another $70,000 of grants, $30,000 of bonds. This is a very valuable, program, but it's only available if you qualify for the disability tax credit.
And the onus is on the applicant to make the case that they qualify, and it's not simple. It's not like, it's available to left-handed people and I can prove that I'm left-handed. There is a medical practitioner, as you say. There's a bunch of paperwork. Give us the essence of that application process and I have no idea if this number is available. What percentage of applicants might get the yes?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. We don't have that percentage. That's kind of a guarded secret. I think they have published stats over the years on that, and it does vary year by year. But look, in some cases, it's very, very straightforward. If you have a clear disability and there's no gray area, then, really it's just a matter. You can fill out the form yourself. You can go online to the Government of Canada's website. You can just Google disability tax credit, Government of Canada. It's going to be the first page there. They've just actually fixed the whole form recently, like in the last year, that you can actually apply digitally. which is really great. So again, very straightforward disability. Let's say someone is completely blind or completely deaf, and you can get a medical practitioner to say that. You're not going to have a problem doing this on your own, right? Just filling out the form, getting the doctor to certify the medical portion, and then getting this approved. Where it gets much more complicated is when you have other types of disability, particularly on mental functioning. And that's where you get areas of, people with ADHD or autism or, things like that, where there are more gray areas. And that's where, sometimes you need to reach out to a professional, whether that's an accountant or a lawyer that specializes in disability services, or in some cases, some of these specialty companies that have been advertising, in the last decade or so, that they will help you navigate these more complex gray cases through the system in return for a fee.
And I feel conflicted about this category of service providers, because on the one hand, I'm sure there's a market for people who can't or don't navigate the path themselves. I don't love that that is a percentage versus, if you pay an estate lawyer to do your will or an accountant to file your taxes, it's a fixed fee, it's transparent, you pay it and you move on. What's your sense for how this the world of consultants and contingency fees works?
Yeah, certainly it's a complex area, and there certainly are views on both sides. And we saw that recently with a court challenge, where in fact the law was tried to change to limit the amount of fees that these providers could provide. In many cases, I believe the typical contingency fee is 30% of what you can recover. And don't forget, it's not just 1 year. You have the ability to go back and get 10 years worth of credits at one time. So if you're talking, $2,000 a year for 10 years, that's $20,000. If they're taking a 30% fee, that's substantial. That's $6,000. So in some cases, for sure, they're doing that kind of work where it's complicated and when you don't know. But I mean, sometimes the cases are, again, as I said, much more straightforward. And a person may have been able to either apply on their own or, have an accountant help them just fill out with the basic form with their medical practitioner. So look, it is complicated. The act is suspended in terms of limiting the fee right now because the courts did take a look at this. The Vancouver court, the BC Supreme Court took a look at this back in the fall of 2011, and there was actually a court injunction that says, look, there's a serious issue here that needs to be resolved before we can limit the amount that people can charge. So, the arguments on both sides are there. Some people will say, look, there are people providing a valuable service. They need to make a living. They need to be paid, a fair amount for their services. On the other hand, we know that in some cases, persons with disabilities sometimes are more vulnerable. And therefore, this legislation was really meant to prevent, people taking advantage of people who are vulnerable, who otherwise might be able to have completed the form on their own.
These costs, as I mentioned, could be a couple thousand, could be tens of thousands. Does the applicant, are they required to demonstrate that they are incurring additional cost, or does the credit live outside of the additional expenses they incur?
So the credit has nothing to do at all with the amount of expenses they incur. So this is just a pure credit if you qualify because you have a long-term disability, and that's defined specifically with one of the basic activities of daily living. You can get all those details online. Then you automatically get this credit. It's right on the tax return. It reduces the tax you pay, or if you don't pay any tax, that could be transferred to certain family members.
One last question. If you had a friend of a friend who had no resources, they didn't have enough credit in the emotional bank account to ask you to help them, would you guide them towards a consultant like this? Or would you say they should, spend the time, learn how to do it, follow through and do it themselves?
Again, I think it would depend on the type of disability this individual had. If I thought it was a very straightforward case, I would certainly either try to help them or I would direct them to maybe a local accounting firm or someone that, specializes in taxes where they could do it, or maybe a friend or family member. If it is one of those more gray areas where it's just more complex and there's maybe multiple disabilities that in turn add up to a significant disability that impairs daily living, then I may suggest they may want to seek out the advice of one of these consulting firms.
Really interesting stuff. Jamie, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Jamie Golombek is Managing Director, Tax and Estate Planning with CIBC Private Wealth in Toronto.